In this fourth and final lecture of my Pharos studies series called A Shameful Conquest, I'm going to talk about Brexit and the culture wars. I shall look at the intellectual and cultural responses and consequences of the 2016 Brexit referendum and try to uncover the connections and the wider issues in Britain and the world. I'll start with a very simple question. How did a political debate about the pros and cons of being members of a trading bloc turn into a long and bitter culture war? You might say that surely the EU was more than a trading bloc. Indeed it was, and is. But don't forget that the huge majority of people in Britain did not buy into the wider ambitions of the EU, whether economic, political or cultural. In 2016, less than 5% of the electorate said that their main reason for voting was their strong attachment to the European project. Part of the answer to my question as to why this issue turned into such a culture war, it would obviously be that these 5% are disproportionately powerful through their huge overrepresentation in academia, parts of the media, the political class and the civil service. 90% of Cambridge academics, for example, voted Remain. Institutional pressure made many younger and more vulnerable academics, and no doubt this is true of people in other institutions such as the civil service, large companies, the city and so on, made them unwilling to express their views because of the possible effects on their careers and indeed on their social lives. But the question still remains as to how the public, and especially this 5%, responded and why they responded in the rather extreme way they did to the 2016 referendum, and how this response might be connected to other issues in British culture and to issues political and cultural in the wider world. And that's the subject of this lecture. So first, the intellectual responses to the Brexit vote. 7 years later, I still get almost every week dropping into my inbox articles by British and overseas academics purporting to analyse and provide insights into the referendum and its consequences. What they practically all have in common is a basic intellectual failure, if I dare to put it so strongly. And that failure is that they assume that Brexit is a uniquely and characteristically British phenomenon and also a pathological one, the expression of some political or cultural disease. If you've watched my earlier lectures, and of course I hope that you may have been persuaded by them, you will be aware that British views of the EU in 2016 at the time of the referendum were very similar to those across the rest of Europe. A paper by the European Council on Foreign Relations in 2013 admitted that, and I quote, Euroscepticism, once seen as a British disease, has now spread across the continent like a virus. Everyone in the EU has been losing faith in the project. Britain, once the Eurosceptic outlier, now looked as if it was the leader of a growing trend. And indeed that was the case, and perhaps in some ways still is, as we see from recent political developments in continental Europe. But this seems to have been completely lost on nearly all the British intelligentsia, those at least who supported Remain. The many books that have appeared since 2016, several by established academics, prominent novelists or well-known media commentators, nearly all share the assumption of British exceptionalism, or as I would put it, this basic misunderstanding of the issue. They're either unaware of or they prefer to ignore the unpopularity of the EU across Europe. They do not look at the EU itself and its failures and problems as a possible cause of the widespread Euroscepticism and in particular of the Brexit vote. Instead, they adopt the easier and more comforting explanation of British or particularly English exceptionalism. The English on one side and everyone else on the other. The English wrong and stupid, everyone else enlightened and modern. And as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, they assume, of course, that this exceptionalism is the symptom of some political or cultural sickness. I ought to mention a partial exception to that rule, who was Anthony Barnett, a well-known political commentator, who in a book on Brexit criticised the EU as what he called a thief in the night, created in defiance of popular consent. Now, I would say that is completely undeniable. Nevertheless, Barnett assumed leave was an internal English pathology, although he said he understood the democratic motives of leavers, but he favoured Remain in the hope of a democratic revolution in the EU. 7 years later, we may judge whether that or though the views of its opponents were more realistic as an intimation of future possibilities. Those who are horrified by the Brexit vote, which is to say most of the intelligentsia, produced a range of arguments to discredit it. The issue, they said, was too complex for the electorate to decide by an in-out referendum, although an in-out referendum was precisely what all political parties had insisted on, when, of course, they thought that Remain would win. It was too difficult, some declared, for democracy itself. Democracy should not be allowed to decide such fundamental matters which were beyond the wit of the uneducated masses. Because when the wrong people form the majority, it is no longer democracy but merely populism. Even, as the Oxford professor Timothy Garton Ash put it, Brexit was among the worst of the current worldwide horde of nationalist populisms. Leavers were described as ignorant, or low information was the euphemism, stupid, poor, or left behind, another euphemism, bigoted and gullible dupes of the tabloid press, the Russians, Cambridge Analytica, the notorious Boris Buss, and, I quote Garton Ash again, it's irresistible to quote him, what he called the silver-tongued demagogues, such as Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. Leave voters were old, depriving the young of their promised land, driven by nostalgia for a world where passports were blue, faces were white, and the map was coloured imperial pink, asserted the leader of the Liberal Democrats. You may remember the Liberal Democrats were the party who finally decided that they would, if they had the chance, simply override the referendum result. Many leavers would soon die anyway, it was argued, so the vote was invalid and should be rerun. The novelist, prominent novelist, widely respected novelist Ian McEwan wrote, by 2019 the country could be in a receptive mood. Well, he got that wrong, but by 2019 the country could be in a receptive mood, he said. 2.5 million over 18-year-olds freshly franchised and mostly Remainers. 1.5 million oldsters, mostly Brexiteers, freshly in their graves. A source of considerable anticipation on McEwan's part. Leavers were not even really people, they were gammon, in the common phrase. If both sides sometimes used inflammatory language, and on the Leave side, enemies of the people, traitors and so on were often flung around as accusations, only the language attacking Leave voters was actually biological. There were admittedly a few attempts by bemused intellectuals to explore darkest England, which they had suddenly realised they didn't understand. One writer, J.D. Taylor, set off on a bicycle to explore England north of the Watford Gap. James Meek, a novelist and journalist, set himself to understand what he called, quote, dreams of leaving and remaining, but he could not escape the cast-iron assumption that leavers were just deluded and Remainers were simply rational. Revealingly, when a farmer he interviewed told him that Brexit might damage farming, but, quote, there are more important things than farming, he could not understand. But condemnation of leavers and the self-assurance of Remainers as a superior class made serious attempts at understanding the former unnecessary, and anti-Brexit writers, including most academics, to judge from my continuing inbox, fell back on a small range of stereotypes. The journalist Fintan O'Toole, perhaps because he's Irish, cannot be too much blamed for having strange ideas about the English, but his book Heroic Failure, Brexit and the Politics of Pain. Politics of pain is a phrase he obviously likes because he's used it in several book titles. This book, The Politics of Pain, was widely praised by English Remainers, The Guardian, of course, needless to say, but it was also a Times Book of the Year. O'Toole saw what he called the Brexit psychodrama as a product of the English reactionary imagination, whose deep pulse was the political erotics of imaginary domination and imaginary submission. He sees a symptom of this in the success of the masochistic novel 50 Shades of Grey, omitting to mention, or perhaps to notice, that this book had been a bestseller in Ireland too, and indeed in the United States and all across the EU. Nevertheless, it was a convenient excuse for ascribing Brexit to some sort of cultural masochism on the part of the English. His other explanation is one that became all-pervasive in hostile explanations of Brexit, that Brexit is, in the words of O'Toole, putting the old white empire back together again. Nostalgia for empire and or the Second World War became the favoured explanation not only among journalists and politicians, but also among supposedly serious academics. Professor Robert Gilday of Oxford University explained Brexit in a rather long book as, quote, the anguish of losing an empire and the fantasy of recovering it. And Professor Timothy Garton-Ash, again, also of Oxford University, blamed, quote, English post-imperial delusions of grandeur. Professor Danny Dorling, Professor of Human Geography, again at Oxford, in a book co-written with Sally Tomlinson of the Department of Education in Oxford, assert that Brexit is a manifestation of a, quote, colonial mentality and the last vestiges of empire working their way out of the British psyche. Anthony Barnett, whom I mentioned a few minutes ago, entitled his book The Lure of Greatness. So was that the problem? Remainers were outraged by what they saw as the British pretension to be great, rather than accepting a diminished role as a mere offshore island of Europe, a rank-and-file member state of the EU. Commented the philosopher John Gray, among all the embarrassingly hackneyed investigations of the post-imperial English psyche that litter the liberal media, you will struggle to find any reference to the dark forces that are shaping European politics. The other strand of Remainer analysis is nostalgia. A young cultural historian, Hannah Rose Woods, wrote a whole book on it entitled Rule Nostalgia. Quite a good title. For her, almost everything in British history is a manifestation of a characteristic nostalgia. Protestantism is nostalgia for primitive Christianity. Catholicism is also nostalgia. Admiration for the classics, that's nostalgia too. Building Palladian country houses is nostalgia, and Gothic revival ones as well. Modern art and sexual liberation have nostalgia lurking in the background. Almost every reference to the past she labels nostalgia. The veteran historian Bernard Porter takes a similar view in a book entitled Britain's Contested History. His starting point is that Britain is uniquely obsessed with its past, just as Wood's starting point is that Britain or England are uniquely nostalgic. Neither tries to argue this case. How could they? One does not need to know much about other European countries to realise that interest in and emotions about the past are universal. Protestantism, classicism, romanticism, ruralism, the Gothic revival and so on are not in any meaningful sense British phenomena, and limiting oneself to British examples of them cannot disguise that obvious fact. The European Union itself is founded on obsessions with the past. But unless these authors and many others like them, indeed nearly all anti-Brexit authors, unless they insist that Britain is the exception, their explanations of Brexit hold no water. The popularity of the nostalgia trope even among historians is rather odd, or at least it would be if they were thinking as historians rather than as polemicists. Because the clear implication is that the European Union is indisputably the future, and so any opposition to it is nostalgia. This is surely an abandonment of basic historical thinking, which can assume no predetermined future. However, to take that view makes it possible to ignore the reality of the EU, rather in the way that pro-Soviet intellectuals in the 1930s could ignore the reality of the USSR, because both represent a future. Many intellectuals have a weakness for utopian visions, and this can become what the interwar French philosopher Julien Banda famously called the treason of the intellectuals, in which intellectual standards of honesty are discarded in favour of support for a particular ideology. Anger and vindictiveness are often present even in some academic works on Brexit. Odium Theologicum did not die out with the Middle Ages. For Porter, Brexit supporters, when not moved by, quote, plain stupidity, are fascists. He admits that fascism is perhaps not a very exact term, but, quote, more and more commentators discern features of proto-fascism in Brexit. Dorling and Kindersley claim that, quote, British governments and the British people in general are very good and very well practiced at being nasty to immigrants, and this was part of the colonial mindset. Never mind that a number of serious studies now have shown that the British are the least anti-immigrant people in Europe. Perhaps academics do get angry, especially when people do not accept their arguments or express scepticism for their favourite utopia. John Gray, whom I've quoted before, calls this the fellow traveller mentality. He says the ease with which fellow travellers pass over the casualties of the regimes with which they identify is one of their defining traits. They are attracted by any large political experiment that seems to prefigure a new order of things. If academics, with some honourable exceptions, generated more heat than light, other branches of the intelligentsia were no better. Fictional writers surely have the basic task of understanding others, and often with some empathy. I don't think many would think that on this occasion they often succeeded. Ian McEwan, whom I've quoted before in a political speech he made, also wrote a novel, I must say a rather slight and unfunny satire, roughly based on Kafka, with an unnamed Boris Johnson and his cabinet turning into cockroaches. Julian Barnes distilled the basic Remainer clichés, deploring Britain's deluded masochistic departure from the European Union. Ali Smith and Kate Atkinson, both distinguished novelists, dropped anti-Brexit asides into novels about other things. Atkinson made the villains in her entertaining thriller Big Sky into Brexiteers, although their business, which was sex trafficking East Europeans, would logically make them enthusiasts for free movement. Jonathan Coe's Middle England was a nostalgic satire in which all the nice characters were Remainers and Brexiteers were old, bigoted and manipulated by sinister forces. However, he gives the novel a cheerful ending as the Brexiteers all die and the nice people flee Birmingham for sunny Provence and, quote, an endless supply of red wine. Were the anti-Brexit accusations nevertheless true? Was pro-Brexit rhetoric really marked by nostalgia for empire and its supposedly attendant arrogance, xenophobia and racism? Recent studies including one by the EU itself, show Britain as the least racist country in Europe, when it's judged by the lived experience of a large sample of immigrants who are talking about, for example, their experience of relationships with the police, their experience of violence, their experience in the workplace, their access to housing, and in all those, by all those criteria, the UK comes out very well. So it's difficult to explain Brexit by racism. Not impossible, but on the face of it, difficult. There was indeed a vision of freer trading round the world and of an independent yet global Britain, as the phrase went. The Irish critic John Foster Wilson suggested that this might simply be a rational reaction. Apart from vast overseas markets that the UK at present cannot independently exploit, he writes, there might be practical economic and logistical advantages in trading with partners who share history, a language, and memories of a common culture. As for strictly imperial nostalgia, the Harvard professor of government Richard Tuck, one of the small minority of academic leavers, pointed out that we are not going to find much nostalgia for the empire among the working class communities which voted to leave the EU, who historically had been hostile or indifferent to the empire. Tuck goes further and turns the tables on supporters of the EU. To quote him, they are the kind of person who in their grandfather's or now great-grandfather's day would have been happy running the empire. The EU offered itself as a kind of alternative stage upon which these old imperial ruling classes could regain something of the role they had lost. This is the nostalgia that underpinned and still underpins the EU, while the nostalgia of Brexit is in reality a desire for a final emancipation from the burden of empire. This is a point I alluded to in earlier lectures, which explains, I suggest, the overwhelming hostility of the Foreign Office to Brexit. This is not merely a British view. As I argued in my second lecture, French ambitions to lead the EU have a quasi-imperial element, and the Dutch politician Guy Verhofstadt, in criticising Brexit, practically paraphrased the arch-imperialist Joseph Chamberlain. I quote Verhofstadt, "The world of tomorrow is not based on nation-states. It is a world order that is based on empires," of which, of course, he assumes that the EU is one. I wouldn't say, of course, that all Remainers were conscious or unconscious nostalgics for imperial power, though interestingly Verhofstadt's speech was not booed by the Liberal Democrats, who are normally so woke, but it was actually cheered by them at their party conference in 2019. But those who obsessed about empire certainly seem to regard empire as a synonym for national power and independence. Without empire, no power, no independence, and hence any demand for national independence is assumed somehow to be equally a demand for empire. But on the left, anti-colonialism has of course become a shibboleth, which in the words of Lord Sumption in his recent Pharos lecture adopts a highly selective approach to the past, which sees everything through the spectrum of race. Hence, for the identitarian left, the British Empire was racist and therefore bad, and anything that can be associated with it, in this case Brexit, must also be bad. So to associate Brexit with the empire is a way of condemning it. Intellectuals who publicly supported or accepted leaving were far fewer than those who condemned it. One of the most notable was the prominent conservative philosopher Roger Scruton, who prioritised not empire, but a much smaller scale culture, community and nation, what he called a society held together by trust between strangers, the bedrock of tolerance, democracy and inclusivity. He regretted that many Remainers seemed animated by what he called repudiation of home, the turning away from the inherited first-person plural, the sense of being we. This, I very much fear, is indeed an important clue to how the debate over Brexit is linked to wider culture wars, both in Britain and beyond. The anger and resentment shown on both sides of the debate, admittedly, but I would say particularly on the anti-Brexit side, does suggest that for the most vocal Remainers there is indeed a repudiation of home, a turning away from the first-person plural. There seems to me, and this is merely based on personal observation, not on any study, but there seems to me to be no strict border in terms of age, sex or class. But among the young middle class, as I suggested in an earlier lecture, there does seem to be an overwhelming repudiation, at least as what they see of what they see as the majority of their own nation, the Brexit majority, supposedly made up of old white male racists and ignoramuses. There may be, indeed I think there is, more going on here than simply a disagreement about Britain and the EU and the relations between the two. Many hard-line Remainers, and here I stress that I'm not talking about everyone who voted Remain in 2016, many or most of whom, as I said in an earlier lecture, were motivated primarily by economic worry. But I'm talking about the hard-line Remainers, or rejoiners as they're often known, who lead the campaign against Brexit and in favour of some sort of reattachment to the EU. The oddity is that these people seem oddly ignorant of and uninterested in the EU as a working political and economic system. And this paradox, according to a recent academic monograph by Adam Fagen and Stijn van Kessel, called The Failure of Remain, was a fundamental cause of weakness of the Remain-Rejoin movement. That is, as they point out, it was an anti-Brexit movement rather than a pro-EU movement. It was a negative reaction to a popular vote seen as somehow illegitimate and populist, but without being based on a positive case for EU membership. The rejoiners have no positive vision of the EU to propose, indeed no real vision of the EU at all, and hence no response, and this is the point made by Fagen and Van Steen, hence no response to criticisms of the EU as an entity, no answer to questions about, for example, the effects of free movement, lack of democratic accountability, or economic failings. Their attachment to the EU, therefore, is not a function of the successes of the EU, but of their dislike of Brexiteers and all that they suppose them to stand for. And what they think Brexiteers stand for is, and indeed this may be partly true, is above all the idea of the independent nation state, which the enemies, the rejoiner faction, regard as nostalgic, colonialist, and so on. Why is the nation state something that anti-Brexiteers reject? I think I'll from now on use this term anti-Brexiteer for the hardline element, or the ABs perhaps I might say. For older ABs, it may be linked to traditional left-wing views of internationalism, though these have little real connection to the EU as it actually exists. For younger ABs, we have David Goodhart's seminal distinction between what he calls anywhere people and somewhere people. Anywhere people are detached by their university education and their occupation from local communities and in many cases from the national community. Living in cosmopolitan cities like London, they feel little connection with their birthplace or the national community. And this may give them certain advantages, as the economist Sir Paul Collier has suggested. All across the EU, he says, the well-educated metropolitans who have enjoyed rising relative incomes have gradually peeled off from shared national identity. The option of being European, Collier continues, has perhaps been a convenient justification for them to withdraw from obligations to their provincial fellow citizens. But those provincial fellow citizens, the often poorer somewhere people, necessarily suffer a range of disadvantages from this peeling away from national identity. Again, to quote Collier, the potential for European identity to substitute for national identity has profound consequences for the poorer citizens of Europe's nations. For them, the post-war sense of shared national identity had become a hugely valuable asset. Post-1980, just as the new economic forces, that's to say, globalization, the new economic forces of social divergence were necessitating national solidarity, what in British politics has come to be called levelling up, this sense of shared identity was being unwound, making policy to level up or to close gaps between the anywhere and the somewhere people much more difficult to carry out. Indeed, ABs, anti-Brexiters, seem quite keen to unwind this sense of common identity. Theresa May, in a speech in 2016, said, and I quote, "Today, too many people in positions of power behave as though they have more in common with international elites than with the people down the road, the people they employ, the people they pass in the streets. But if you believe you're a citizen of the world," she said, "you're a citizen of nowhere. You don't understand what the very word citizenship means," by which, of course, she implied duties as well as rights. The howls of outrage from those very elites proved her point. Yet there's more going on here, again, than simply relative economic advantage. Brexit's only one of a linked set of dividing lines in society. The anti-Brexit group, the ABs, coincide on issues issues that are colloquially described as woke. Although there is on the face of it no connection with attitudes towards the EU, which is hardly in reality a woke institution, this set of issues has in common a rejection of traditional identities and sentiments in favour of what John Gray, quoted him before, calls a farrago of critical race and gender theories imported from America: decolonization, anti-racism, transgenderism, green radicalism, and now pro-Palestinian activism. This sort of thing is not an entirely new phenomenon. Many young people in recent past generations have shown a misplaced enthusiasm for Stalinism, Maoism, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, the Khmer Rouge, and even the Ayatollah Khomeini. As the Czech novelist Milan Kundera put it, what makes a leftist is not this or that theory, but the ability to integrate any theory into the kitsch called the Grand March, which is what he called, the Grand March, he called, quote, "the splendid march on the road to brotherhood, equality, justice, happiness." The modern term is intersectionality, and the journalist Mary Harrington has called this the omnicause, which I quite like. The history of today's Grand March or omnicause is now becoming quite well known through a series of accessible studies. It's a mixture of Marxist anti-colonial theory drawn less from historical data about empires than from a few key theoretical texts, added to an Americanized version of Franco-German postmodernist relativism, and topped off with an equally American obsession with race. Ironically, this omnicause has had far less impact in the EU than in the Anglosphere. Indeed, recent political developments seem to show that the continent is reacting against some of the tenets of this identitarian radicalism by electing populist and nationalist parties to power. Here we see, to note in passing, even more dramatically the divergence between the anti-Brexit sentiments of young Britons and the rising anti-EU and anti-establishment sentiments of young Europeans. For example, in France, a majority of voters under 35 support Marine Le Pen. The reasons why the omni-cause has more of an impact in the Anglosphere can largely be explained, perhaps it can mostly be explained, by the huge influence of American culture, now hugely magnified by the internet and social media. But in addition, the Anglosphere countries have in common the fact of forming the historical and present-day core of the West, of being associated with or being the products of empire and colonial settlement, though of course this is true of far more countries than the Anglosphere, and of being seen as the creators, defenders and beneficiaries of a Western so-called colonialist world order, economic, political and intellectual, even or especially intellectual. Hence demands that intellectual pursuits as far apart as botany, mathematics, music and the natural sciences should be decolonized. Empiricism, the editors of the journal History and Technology have recently declared, is based on, I quote, the predicating logics of colonialism and racial capitalism. Empiricism is colonialist. History has become the principal battleground. Slavery, or more precisely Atlantic slavery as practiced by Britain and America, rather than the slavery existing round the world since the dawn of time, has been made a topic of great emotional power. The British Empire has been demonized as nothing but a system of violence, exploitation and oppression, and its considerable achievements have been denied. Settlement has been associated with genocide. The West, and particularly the Anglophone countries, are thus delegitimized, their successes denied, and demands made for them to pay huge reparations to those claiming to be their victims. We have seen in recent weeks how decolonization can be used to excuse and even glorify acts of almost unimaginable barbarity if the victims, even babies, can be seen as colonialists. For years, we have allowed this ideology to take over many or most of our educational and cultural institutions. Professor Frank Furedi has argued this, and I quote again, "The goal of cancelling the legacy of Western civilization is pursued through reorganizing society's historical memory and disputing and delegitimizing its ideals and achievement. There has never been a time in living memory when so much energy has been devoted to readjusting the past and questioning and criticizing historical figures and institutions." This observation may seem to have taken me a long way from Brexit, but the overall title of these lectures is A Shameful Conquest, taken from John of Gaunt's lament about England, which, he says, hath made a shameful conquest of itself. My subject, then, is not just Brexit, but the turmoil and dissension that have taken place in Britain during the 7 years since the 2016 referendum, partly caused by it, partly exposed by it, and partly due to connections with the wider world beyond the United Kingdom and indeed beyond the European Union. So now I should try to draw the threads together and summarize the story and what I think it means. In 2016, a popular vote decided, by a small but clear majority, to leave the EU. The referendum had been intended to end the debate by a vote to remain, and the government and powerful interests had campaigned to ensure that outcome. But when the electorate decided the opposite, a powerful coalition refused to accept the result and campaigned by various means to stop or nullify it. And some are still doing so. These issues I summarized in my first lecture, and in the second I compared French and British attitudes to European integration with the intention of illuminating the complexities of how countries and their elites related to the European project. The motives of those who continued to oppose Brexit after 2016 were various. Fear of economic consequences and resentment at the consequences for certain individual interests were clearly important. Yet as the economic consequences gradually proved to be slight or even positive, the controversy did not abate. Indeed, huge and sustained efforts have been made and are still being made to persuade the public that there was, or had been, or would be severe economic damage. Here I have to speculate to some extent as to motives. Some were political, a determination to prevent the Brexit wing of the Conservative Party from being victorious and perhaps becoming politically dominant. The prominent Labour MP Stella Creasy, speaking at a debate in which I took part, said, and I may be slightly paraphrasing her, "We have to force the Tories to accept that Brexit is a failure and that it is their fault." That would be the only road to political victory, not only for Labour, but for the Remainer majority of Conservative MPs, some of whom tried, by questionable constitutional means, to hamstring Boris Johnson's government. The long-drawn-out uncertainty as to the outcome of the 2016 vote surely made the political division of 2016 far deeper and angrier. The loathing of Boris Johnson is unusual in our politics, loathed not only for his failings, but also for his successes. In this final lecture, I tried to move beyond pure politics, or perhaps impure politics, into the realms of the culture wars, and to show how Brexit connects with other issues. The great majority of the intelligentsia opposed Brexit bitterly, but without being particularly in favour of the EU, a paradox brought out in the recent book I mentioned by Adam Fagen and Steen van Kessel. The explanation of the paradox must be that the intelligentsia is rejecting what it thinks that Brexit stands for, namely a defence of the nation-state, which its opponents condemn as archaic, absurd, xenophobic, racist and white. John Gray, whom I've quoted earlier, comments that, quote, "The progressive mind detests national identity with passionate intensity." In this lecture I've given a number of examples of this attitude. It surely, rather than any consideration of the pros and cons of EU membership, which has practically disappeared from the debate, explains anti-Brexit anger and also links the Brexit debate with other elements of the omni-cause. How many members of Extinction Rebellion or Queers for Palestine do you think support Brexit? Yet the old left did oppose the EU, and some have suggested that Jeremy Corbyn's lack of enthusiasm for Remain made leaving possible. In fact, I remember a Labour peer saying precisely that to me. I should say a pro-Remain Labour peer who said, we owe Brexit really to Jeremy. That, I suppose, is a contested view. In earlier lectures, I've referred to Peter Mayer's analysis of the political void between rulers and ruled. This now exists across the Western world. There have been reactions against it, and it is easy to condemn them all as populist, which I'm tempted to define as democracy when you dislike the result. Hence the phenomenon of Donald Trump has often been compared with Brexit to discredit the latter. But the attempt to take back control and close the void takes very different forms in different political cultures. In ours, it was a legal and moderate attempt to breathe new life into existing institutions, not to destroy them, as is the case for many of Trump's supporters. Anger admittedly was caused when those running the institutions resisted, kicking and screaming, having new life breathed into them. The mordant philosopher John Gray, I realise I'm quoting him quite a lot, but he's a very pithy writer, and indeed almost unique in being not quite unique, but extremely rare in being a pro-Brexit philosopher. So I don't really apologise for quoting him. Anyway, he judged this phenomenon unkindly. It would have required, he said, hard work and new thinking to accept Brexit, a prospect our ruling elites would rather avoid. In recent months, Remainer rejoiner groups have produced opinion polls suggesting that a majority now regrets Brexit. While this is pretty meaningless, even if it's valid, because after all, this requires no particular action. For the anti-Brexit hardcore, it provides ammunition in their continuing campaign to reverse or nullify Brexit. While no sane politician is considering formally reversing Brexit, there are many who are considering nullifying it by aligning Britain with the EU as a non-member, a satellite in plain terms. Labour's shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy spoke very much along those lines very recently. This at a time when the EU is economically stagnant, internationally impotent and politically fragmenting, with populist politics rising in several countries, often with the disproportionate support of young voters, seems an odd ambition. But as I've argued, the EU is pretty irrelevant. The aim is to defeat Brexit and the Brexiteers. And this mindset has spread into the nihilistic omni-cause of the radical left, a supporter of all identities except that of the nation. The journalist Mary Harrington, whom I've also quoted earlier, takes a pessimistic view. I quote, "There is now very little elite support for the geographically and politically bounded, democratically governed nation-state that Brexit voters sought to defend." If this is true, we have indeed made a shameful conquest of ourselves. 7 years of political debates and turmoil will have been for nothing, and the democratic impulse of 2016 will have been stifled. Beyond the issue of Brexit, as I have argued, there is a wider culture war across the Anglophone world, which we are very close to losing, as major institutions have been taken over by militants of the omni-cause. The feminist writer Joanne Williams sees it thus: Western societies have created a generation of young people who are antagonistic to their own national history. Education has often actively cultivated feelings of shame towards nations such as the UK, the US and Australia. Both the school curriculum and popular children's television programmes damn British history as an unbroken story of slavery, colonialism and countless other acts of barbarism. This is a story without heroes or acts of redemption. Does Britain's solid popular support for Ukraine show that there is still some hope? It was notable how many Ukrainian flags were being flown in Brexit voting regions, as the defenders of one nation sympathised with the defenders of another. Those of us who study history can play a part in restoring sanity and defending our societies from further damage. We can insist on telling the full truth as best we can, both about Brexit and about our history in general. I hope it's not too late.